My uncle built this bike with his own hands. He's dying. His last wish is just to hear it run one more time. The words hit the shop like a sledgehammer through glass. Four mechanics stood in a half circle around a rusted, oil-blackened 1977 shovelhead, a machine that looked like it had crawled out of a grave, and not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke, because every man in that room understood the same brutal truth at the exact same moment. This wasn't a repair job anymore. This was a dying man's last heartbeat sitting on two wheels. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to the channel right now, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The bike came in on a Tuesday. Nobody called ahead. Nobody warned anyone. One moment the shop floor was quiet, the ordinary Tuesday morning, kind of quiet, coffee still hot, the radio playing something low and country in the back, and then the door swung open and a young man pushed a motorcycle through it like he was pushing a coffin. Marcus Webb saw it from across the room and felt something shift in his chest. Not admiration, not curiosity, something closer to dread. He had been running Webb's custom and repair for 22 years. Before that, he'd spent 11 years apprenticing under a man named Dutch Hargrove, who had himself spent 30 years working on machines that other shops turned away. Marcus had seen basket cases. He'd seen total losses. He'd seen bikes that had been submerged in rivers, bikes that had sat under collapsed barns for 2 decades, bikes that had been partially disassembled by amateurs who didn't know what they were doing and had given up halfway through, leaving the engine in pieces, scattered across the floor like some kind of mechanical autopsy gone wrong. He thought he had seen everything. The 1977 shovelhead rolling across his shop floor made him reconsider that belief entirely. It was not just old. Old was manageable. Old was history. Old was character. Old was a challenge worth taking. This bike was something past old. The chrome that remained in there wasn't much had oxidized to a dull, chalky gray. The engine cases were stained with 47 years of accumulated grime oil, seepage, moisture damage, and what Marcus would later identify as the residue of at least 3 different failed repair attempts by people who clearly hadn't known what they were doing. The tank had a dent on the left side that looked like it had been hit by something heavy. Maybe a fall, maybe a collision, maybe just the slow weight of time pressing down on it. The seat leather had cracked and peeled until only strips of it remained, revealing the foam beneath which had compressed and hardened into something more like wood than cushion. The exhaust pipes were rusted through in 2 places, not surface rust. Through. The handlebars were slightly bent to the left, throwing the whole geometry of the machine off by just enough that it looked subtly wrong, like a photograph hung at a 3-degree angle, the kind of wrong that isn't immediately obvious, but burrows under your skin once you notice it. Marcus did not move toward it right away. He stood where he was, cup of coffee in his right hand, and he studied it the way a doctor studies an X-ray before walking into a room to deliver news. Then he looked at the young man who had pushed it in. He was maybe 28 years old. Dark hair long on top, pushed back from his face with the kind of nervous energy that comes from not sleeping well. He was wearing a jacket that was a size too big for him, a man's jacket on a frame that hadn't quite grown into it yet, and his eyes were red around the edges. Not the red of crying exactly, the red of someone who had been fighting the urge to cry for so long that the effort had started to show on his face. He stood behind the bike with both hands still resting on the handlebars like he was afraid to let go of it. Marcus set his coffee down on the workbench. "Where'd you bring this in from?" he asked. "Storage unit," the young man said. "Out on Route 9. It's been there since 2004. Marcus exhaled slowly. 20 years in a storage unit. He revised his damage assessment upward. "What's your name, son?" Danny Reyes." "Danny." Marcus walked toward the bike, now slowly, hands in his pockets. He crouched down beside the engine. Up close, the damage was even more extensive than it had appeared from across the room. He could already see that the primary chain cover was cracked. He could already see the oil residue that had pooled and dried and pooled again around the base of the engine until it had formed a crust that was almost geological in its layering. He could see without even touching anything that someone had at some point attempted to replace the points and had stripped one of the mounting screws in the process and then apparently walked away from the job. He stood back up. "Tell me why you brought it here." Danny's jaw moved. He was working up to something. Marcus waited. My uncle built this bike, Danny said. Salvatore Reyes. He built it from parts he collected over about 3 years starting in 1974. He finished it in 1977. He rode with a club for a while, Hells Angels Oakland chapter. He left the club in 1989. He kept the bike. And the bike's been in that storage unit since 2004. He had a stroke, Danny said. First one, 2004. He couldn't ride anymore. He couldn't bring himself to sell it, so he put it away. He figured he'd get better. Danny paused. He didn't. Marcus nodded slowly. And now, he had another stroke 2 weeks ago. Danny's voice didn't crack, but it got careful the way voices get when the person speaking them is rationing their composure. He's at Mercy General. The doctors are saying. He stopped, started again. They're saying it could be days or weeks. They don't know. The shop was quiet. Joey had stopped working somewhere behind Marcus. Terrence had come in from the back bay without Marcus noticing and was standing near the tool cabinet. Carlos had his arms crossed and was looking at the floor. His last wish, Danny said, and his voice went even quieter, is to hear this bike run one more time. Just once. He doesn't need to ride it. He doesn't need to see it. He just wants to hear it. Over the phone, if that's all we can do. He swallowed. He keeps saying that if it runs again, it means something. That some things can come back from the dead. Nobody said anything. Then Marcus said, leave your number. I'll call you. After Danny left, Marcus stood in front of the shovelhead for a long time without speaking. Joey came to stand beside him. Joey Navarro was 26, the youngest mechanic on the floor, and he had a gift for modern diagnostic work that Marcus genuinely respected. The kid could pull codes and interpret data with an intuitive speed that still impressed him after 3 years. Joey understood fuel injection, ride-by-wire systems, electronic ignition. He had grown up on computers and sensors and data readouts. You're going to let us try it, Joey said. It wasn't quite a question. I'm going to let you try it, Marcus said. Joey looked at the bike with the expression of a man who has just agreed to something he isn't certain about. It's a shovelhead. I've read about them, but I've never actually. You've never worked on one. Not a running one, no, and this one is definitely not running. That's why it's called a repair, Marcus said. Go. I'll go. Joey worked for 4 hours and 19 minutes. Marcus tracked it because he kept checking the clock on the wall above the tool chest, not obsessively, but the way you check the time when you're aware of something building toward a conclusion you already suspect you won't like. At the 2-hour mark, he walked past Joey's station and saw the young mechanic on his knees with a flashlight aimed into the engine interior. His laptop open on a rolling stool beside him. The diagnostic software open on screen and doing absolutely nothing because the 1977 shovelhead had no ports, no sensors, no interface of any kind that spoke to modern diagnostic equipment. It was a machine from another era, one that predated the very concept of electronic diagnostics by 20 years, and every modern tool Joey reached for was useless the moment it made contact with the problem. Marcus didn't stop. He just noted it and walked on. At the 4-hour mark, Joey came and found him. The young mechanic was holding a bolt in his left hand, just holding it like he wasn't sure where it had come from or where it was supposed to go back to. His hands were black to the wrist, and there was a streak of grease along his left cheekbone where he'd pushed his hair back. I can't get a read on anything, Joey said. There's no data. There's no interface. Everything I know how to do, none of it applies here. It's not like working on a machine. It's like working on, I don't even know, a fossil. What did you find? Oil pump is compromised. I can see that from the sealing surface, it's been leaking for a long time and the damage has built up. Beyond that, I can't tell you more without pulling things apart further, and every time I try to pull something apart, I run into a fastener that's either seized or stripped or both. He paused. I dropped a bolt into the engine. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. I got it out, Joey added quickly, but it took 40 minutes. It fell into the timing case. Go write up what you found, Marcus said. Give it to Terrence. Joey looked at the bolt in his hand, then set it on the workbench. I'm sorry, Marcus. Don't be sorry, be accurate. Write down everything you found. Terrence Okafor was 41 years old, and he was the closest thing to an old-school mechanic that Marcus had on his regular floor crew. He had grown up in his father's shop in Lagos before immigrating at 22, and he had a patience with engines that Marcus had always valued, a willingness to sit with a problem, to take it apart slowly and study each component rather than attacking the machine with solutions. He lasted 6 hours. When he came to Marcus, he brought a small tray on which he had laid out his findings: a cracked rocker arm, a valve stem that had worn to the edge of its tolerance, a primary chain that had stretched so far past its service limit that Terrence said it had been a wonder the engine had ever run at all, let alone for as long as it apparently had. The rocker arm alone would have killed it, Terrence said. But the rocker arm isn't even the worst of it. The worst of it is what I found when I started looking at the carburetor. Someone installed an incorrect float needle wrong application probably 10-15 years ago. It's been running rich since then. The combustion residue is everywhere. Can you fix it? Terrence was quiet for a moment. I can fix the individual components, but Marcus, every time I fix one thing, I find two more things underneath it. This engine hasn't been maintained in decades. It hasn't been run in 20 years. Everything that should move is seized. Everything that should seal is leaking. I fixed the carburetor, the ignition timing is wrong. I addressed the timing, the oil pump is failing. I address the oil pump, and I find the rocker arm. He spread his hands. There's no floor to this problem. I keep digging and I keep finding more. Keep going, Marcus said. I'm not done. Terrence's expression shifted, not protest, but something honest. For how long? Until you can't. Derek went in the next morning. Derek Cho was 33 years old, and he was the most technically aggressive mechanic Marcus had ever employed. Where Joey was methodical and Terrence was patient, Derek was combative. He attacked problems. He forced solutions. He relied on his own physical strength and confidence to muscle through obstacles that stopped more cautious mechanics cold. He lasted 3 hours. He came out with oil on his shirt and something very close to frustration on his face, which on Derek was unusual enough to be alarming. The oil pump's worse than Terrence thought, Derek said. I tried to pull it for inspection, and the mounting flange cracked. It was already stressed it was going to fail eventually, but now it's failed definitively. So that's a definite replacement, not a repair. He paused. And the bolt I removed from the primary cover, the head sheared. I've got a broken bolt in the primary cover now. Marcus looked at him. I know, Derek said. I know. I used an extractor. The extractor slipped and took a chunk out of the adjacent surface. How bad? Bad enough. Marcus sat down on the stool by his workbench. He rubbed his face with both hands. Around the shop, Carlos had his head down, working on a Road King that had come in for routine service, but his movements were slower than usual. The whole shop had quieted, had taken on the particular weight of a collective problem that was spreading. Carlos tried in the afternoon. He was meticulous, careful, experienced, and he came to Marcus 2 hours in with something in his expression that Marcus had never seen on Carlos before. Something that looked like pity. Marcus, Carlos said, I found a crack in the rocker box, not the one Terrence found, a different one, on the right side. How bad is the crack? It's been repaired before, poorly. Someone tried to weld it at some point and the weld failed, and now there's a crack running through the original casting alongside the failed weld. He paused. This engine has been patched and patched and patched by different people at different times. None of them fixed anything properly. They just covered it long enough to stop thinking about it. The shop was quiet. Marcus looked across the floor at the shovelhead, sitting by itself in the bay, near the far wall, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of 4 mechanics' failed attempts. Trays of removed hardware notes in various handwriting oil rags, a cracked rocker, arm in a plastic bag, a carburetor on a clean piece of cloth, a primary cover with a broken bolt still embedded in it. He said nothing for a long time. Then, everyone go home. He stayed late. The shop emptied out around him, and he sat on the stool across from the shovelhead, and he looked at it in the particular silence of an empty building at night, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant sound of traffic, the occasional sound of the building settling. He thought about Salvatore Reyes, who had built this machine at 23 years old from pieces he'd gathered over 3 years, piece by patient piece, and who had ridden it for more than a decade before a stroke had taken it from him, and who was now dying in a hospital bed 2 miles away and wanted only to hear one more sound before he left. He thought about what Carlos had said, patched and patched and patched, by different people at different times. None of them fixed anything properly. He thought about all the things the bike had survived. 47 years, multiple owners, multiple repair attempts, 20 years in a storage unit, and it was still here. Still in one piece, more or less. Still holding together despite everything working against it. He took out his phone. He stared at a name in his contacts for a long time, a name he hadn't dialed in 4 years. Then he pressed call. It rang 4 times, 5. Then a voice rough, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never learned to be anxious about a ringing phone, because he had lived long enough to stop caring about things that didn't matter. "It's late," the voice said. "I know," Marcus said. "This better be about something real." "It's about a 1977 shovelhead," Marcus said. "He knew you." "Full Hell's Angels build, original engine, hasn't run in 20 years. 4 of my best mechanics have touched it and walked away." A pause on the line. "Where'd you get it?" "Came in today. Owner built it himself. He's dying. He wants to hear it run before he goes." Another pause. Longer this time. "What's wrong with it?" "Everything," Marcus said. "That's the honest answer. Everything you can find, and probably more underneath that. Cracked rocker box, failed oil pump, seized fasteners throughout carburetor, rebuilt wrong broken bolt in the primary timing chain, stretched to the limit, and a frame that hasn't been properly inspected since sometime in the late 90s. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Marcus thought for a moment the call had dropped. Then Walter Boyd said, "I'll be there in the morning." Marcus let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in his chest for hours. "Walter, don't thank me yet," Walter said. "I haven't seen it." "I know. And if it's what you're describing, if it's really as bad as you're saying, I'm going to tell you the truth about it, even if the truth isn't what anyone wants to hear." "That's why I called you," Marcus said. He hung up. He sat in the empty shop for another hour in the quiet and the light of the fluorescents. He looked at the shovelhead. He thought about what Terrence had said. This isn't a repair anymore. It's a resurrection. He thought about Danny Reyes pushing that bike through the door with red-rimmed eyes and shaking hands, and a dying uncle 2 miles away who had one wish left in him. He turned off the lights. He went home, but he did not sleep. Walter Boyd arrived at 7:43 in the morning. Marcus knew because he had been there since 6:30, unable to stay home any longer, drinking his third coffee and pretending to review invoices when what he was actually doing was watching the door. When Walter walked in, the first thing Marcus noticed was the cane. He hadn't used one 4 years ago. The second thing he noticed was that Walter moved with it the way certain men move with injuries, not leaning on it heavily, not making it the center of his movement, but carrying it alongside himself, the way you carry something you've accepted rather than something you've surrendered to. There was a difference, and Marcus saw it immediately. Walter was 68 years old. His hair had gone fully white since Marcus had last seen him cut short and neat the way it had always been. His hands, even from across the room, were the hands Marcus remembered, wide across the palm, thick through the fingers, stained in the creases with grease that decades of washing had driven into the skin permanently, the way a life's work does when you've done it long enough. He was wearing dark work pants and a plain gray shirt with the sleeves already rolled to the elbow, despite the morning chill, and he carried a canvas tool bag over his left shoulder that was worn soft with age and use. He didn't say good morning. He walked straight to the shovelhead. Marcus didn't speak either. He just followed, stopping a few feet back, and watched. Walter stood in front of the bike for almost 2 full minutes without touching it. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is reading, not just seeing his eyes moving slowly, methodically from the front end to the rear down to the ground, clearance back up to the engine cases, across to the tank, down the frame rails on both sides. He crouched down slowly, the cane steadying him, and looked at the underside of the engine. He straightened up. He walked around to the right side and looked at it from that angle, then the left. Then he put his right hand on the engine, not gripping it, not examining it, just resting his palm flat against the engine case like he was taking a temperature or a pulse. His eyes closed. Joey had come in behind Marcus at some point and was standing near the tool chest with his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. Terrence had arrived without Marcus noticing and was leaning against the far workbench with his arms folded. Derek was in the doorway to the back bay. Carlos was standing near his station, but facing the wrong direction for whatever he was pretending to work on. Every man in the shop was watching Walter Boyd put his hand on a dead engine and close his eyes, and not one of them made a sound. 30 seconds passed, maybe 40. Then Walter opened his eyes and said quietly to no one in particular, "This engine isn't broken. It's forgotten how to trust people." Nobody moved. Joey lowered his coffee cup slowly. Marcus saw Terrence unfold his arms. Derek took one step forward from the doorway, then stopped himself. Walter straightened and turned to Marcus. "Show me what your people found, son." They spread everything out on the long center workbench. Terrence's notes. Joey's diagnostic attempts. Derek's damage report, the parts tray with the cracked rocker arm in its plastic bag. Carlos's photographs of the cracked and rewelded rocker box. Walter went through all of it without hurrying. He picked up the cracked rocker arm and held it up to the light and turned it slowly between his fingers, studying the fracture line the way a jeweler studies a stone. He read each set of notes in turn, and when he was done reading one page, he set it down with the same careful deliberateness and picked up the next. When he was finished, he stood with his hands flat on the workbench and looked at everything laid out before him. "Who dropped the bolt into the timing case?" he asked. Joey raised his hand slightly. "That was me. Did you get it out clean?" "Yes, sir." Walter nodded. "Who stripped the primary cover fastener?" "Me," Derek said from across the room. No defensiveness in it, just the fact. "How deep did the extractor go before it slipped?" Derek told him. Walter listened without interrupting, then nodded once. "All right," he said. He turned to Marcus. "I need the shop cleared except for one person. Whoever's most comfortable being wrong." Marcus blinked. "Come again." "Whoever can stand next to me and hear something they don't understand and not feel the need to explain it or argue with it. That's who stays." Walter glanced across the four mechanics. "The rest work on other things. I don't need an audience, and I don't need help right now. I need quiet." Marcus looked at his crew. Terrence met his eyes and gave the smallest shake of his head, not refusing, just acknowledging that Walter wasn't describing him. Derek had already turned back toward the bay. Joey looked at the floor. Carlos said from his station, "I'll stay." Walter looked at him for a moment. Something passed between them that Marcus couldn't entirely read. Then Walter said, "Get a stool." On. Marcus tried to focus on the Road King at Joey's station. He failed approximately every 4 minutes, his attention pulling back across the shop floor to the shovelhead and the two figures beside it. Walter moving slowly and with great deliberateness, Carlos on a stool nearby, occasionally handing a tool when asked otherwise still. What struck Marcus watching from a distance was the silence. When his other mechanics worked, there was noise, the percussion of tools, the muttered commentary, the occasional curse when something seized or something slipped. There was the aggressive vocabulary of men fighting with machines. Walter worked in near silence. The sounds that came from his direction were small, careful sounds, the soft click of a socket being seated, the measured creak of a fastener being persuaded rather than force the whisper of a rag across metal. It was not the sound of a man attacking a problem. It was the sound of a man having a conversation. At 10:30, Walter said something to Carlos that Marcus couldn't hear. Carlos got up and went to the parts cabinet in the back, spent 5 minutes finding something and came back. He handed it to Walter. Whatever it was, Walter held it up, examined it, and set it aside. Then he held out his hand again, and Carlos gave him something else. At 11:15, Marcus's phone buzzed. Danny Reyes. He stepped outside to take the call. "How is it going?" Danny asked. The question was careful. The voice of someone who has learned not to hope too loudly because hope has a way of making disappointment worse. "We have someone new on it," Marcus said. "A specialist." "A specialist in what?" "In old things that other people have given up on." A pause. "Is that actually a thing?" "This man is," Marcus said. Another pause, longer. Then Danny said, "The hospital called this morning. They're saying he's..." He stopped. "They're moving him to comfort care. Do you know what that means?" Marcus knew what it meant. "How long?" "They said maybe a week, maybe less." Danny's voice was doing that careful thing again, the rationing. He asked about the bike this morning. First thing when he woke up before anything else, he asked if anyone had called about the bike. The nurse said he asked 3 times. Marcus pressed his back against the outer wall of the shop and looked up at the sky. "Tell him someone's working on it. Tell him the right man is on it now." "Is that true?" "Yes," Marcus said, and he meant it in a way he hadn't meant anything in a while. "That is absolutely true." He hung up and went back inside. Walter found the first real disaster at noon. Marcus knew because he heard Carlos say, "Oh no," quietly under his breath, the way you say something when you don't mean anyone else to hear it, but the information is too large to stay entirely inside. He crossed the floor. Walter was holding the oil pump, not the housing, not a component, the entire assembly, which he had apparently extracted intact, which was itself remarkable, given what Derek had described about the mounting flange condition. He was holding it in both hands and turning it slowly. "Pull up a stool," Walter said to Marcus, without looking up. Marcus pulled up a stool. "The flange crack your man found," Walter said, "runs further than he reported. It doesn't stop at the visible surface. It runs into the pump body itself along a fault line that's been there, I'd estimate, since sometime in the 80s. This pump was run low on oil chronically over a long period. The thermal stress built up over years, and this crack developed slowly." He turned the pump so Marcus could see the fracture line. "The pump can't be repaired. It has to be replaced. Finding a replacement oil pump for a 77 shovelhead is not impossible," Walter said. "It is not easy, and it will not be fast, and whatever you find will need to be inspected before installation, because most of what's floating around out there in that application has the same history of neglect. But it's not impossible." He set the pump down on the cloth Carlos had laid out. "The carburetor. What about it?" "Whoever rebuilt it last, and I'm guessing this was sometime in the early 2000s, based on the part markings, they installed the correct float needle this time, but they set the float height wrong. The engine has been running rich by a significant margin. The combustion deposits throughout the top end are a consequence of that. I'll need to go through the intake tract completely." He paused. "The rocker arm, your man Terrence pulled the cracked one." "Yes. That's not the only cracked one. There's a hairline on the left exhaust rocker that Terrence didn't find because it's only visible under magnification at a specific angle." Walter picked up the plastic bag with Terrence's rocker arm and set it back down. "So we need 2 rockers, not 1. And they have to be matched. You can't put mismatched rockers on this engine without risking an imbalance that would show up as vibration and accelerated wear." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Then what are we looking at realistically?" Walter considered the question with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything. "A week minimum, possibly 2. And that's if every part we need materializes when we need it and nothing else turns up that we haven't found yet. The family is talking about days." Walter looked at Marcus directly for the first time since the conversation had started. His eyes were gray and very steady. "I understand that," he said. "I'm telling you anyway, because the machine doesn't care about the family's timeline. And if we rush this for the wrong reasons, we build in a failure that will bite someone down the road. Possibly literally." "The bike runs 1 time for a dying man," Marcus said. "That's all we need." "We need it to run reliably," Walter said. 1 start, 1 run, and it doesn't kill the person who kicks it. That's the minimum. And to get there honestly from where this machine currently is takes the time it takes." He held Marcus's gaze. "Are we clear on that?" "We're clear." "Good." Walter turned back to the workbench. "I'll need access to your lathe." Marcus blinked. "You're going to fabricate something." "The rocker arm I need I can source one given time I may not have. Or I can make one. I've made them before. On a better lathe than yours probably, but on a lathe, yes." He picked up a measuring tool and bent over the remaining rocker assembly. "I'll need good stock material in about 6 hours without interruption. Your man Carlos can assist." Carlos, still on his stool, said nothing. But Marcus saw the young mechanic's expression, something complicated, moving across it, a kind of awe that he was trying to keep off his face and wasn't entirely succeeding at. The call from Danny came again at 3 in the afternoon. Marcus was at the parts computer, working through suppliers for the oil pump application, when his phone buzzed against the desk. He answered it on the second ring. "He had a bad hour," Danny said. There was no preamble, no greeting, just that. They had to sedate him. He was agitated, kept trying to get out of bed. The nurses said he kept saying, "The bike, the bike." Danny's voice broke on the last word just slightly, just at the edge before he pulled it back. "Marcus, I need to know if this is possible. I need someone to tell me honestly." Marcus looked across the shop floor at Walter Boyd, who was at the lathe with his sleeves still rolled bent forward over the machine with a focus that was total and complete, his cane leaning against the wall, behind him forgotten. "Yes," Marcus said, "it's possible." "How sure are you?" "I'm sure of the man who's working on it. A long breath on the other end. Okay, Danny said. Okay. And then with a fragility that was impossible not to feel please, Marcus hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then Joey appeared at his shoulder. I found an oil pump, Joey said. Genuine Ironhead application, wrong year. But Walter said to look for he checked the note in his hand. The 74 through 78 range AMF era, because the casting variation in that range is acceptable for this build. There's one in Denver, private seller. He wants $400 and he says it looks clean, but he hasn't run it. Call him, Marcus said. Tell him we want photographs of the ceiling, surfaces, and the gear teeth before we commit. And tell him we need it overnight. He might not do overnight. Tell him it's for a dying man's last wish. Joey looked at Marcus with an expression that was caught between skepticism and something much more earnest. That's true, Marcus said. It's completely true. Make the call. The rocker arm took Walter 7 hours, not 6. The shop had long since gone dark outside. Carlos had eaten a sandwich at the workbench without leaving his stool. Joey had made a run for food at 6 and come back to find no one had changed position. Derek had stayed past his shift without anyone asking him to working quietly on the Road King. That was genuinely his job, while glancing over his shoulder at Walter every 20 minutes, with an expression he kept wiping off his face. At 8:47, Walter lifted the finished rocker, arm off the lathe, and held it up. It was not pretty. It was machined, not polished, functional, in a way that was almost austere, the curves cut true, and the dimensions correct, and nothing beyond that. No concession to aesthetics, no extra time spent on anything that didn't serve the purpose. It was a thing made to work, not to be admired. Walter handed it to Carlos without speaking. Carlos took it in both hands and looked at it for a long moment. He turned it. He ran his thumb along the machine surface where the rocker would bear on the valve stem. He checked the geometry of the pivot bore with his eye. He handed it back. That's good, Carlos said. Quietly, the way you say something when you mean it all the way down. Walter set it on the cloth. He flexed both hands slowly, the first acknowledgement of physical effort he'd shown in 12 hours. He picked up his cane. The pump arrives tomorrow morning, he asked. Should be there by 9, Joey said from across the room. And you inspected the photographs. The gear teeth look clean. The ceiling surfaces look clean. I called a guy I know who's familiar with that application, and he said the markings indicate a mid-run production from 76, which is, he said, those were actually the best ones from that era, because they fixed the casting flaw from the early runs. Walter nodded. Good. He reached for his canvas bag and began to pack his tools with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. I'll be here at 7. Marcus walked him to the door. Outside in the parking lot, Walter paused. He didn't turn around immediately. He stood with one hand on his cane and looked up at the night sky for a moment, and Marcus stood beside him and didn't speak. Then Walter said, that engine has been let down a lot by people who didn't understand it, by people who understood it but didn't care enough, by people who cared but didn't have the skill. He paused. Salvatore Reyes built it right the first time. It was a good build. What happened to it afterward, that's not the machine's fault. Marcus said nothing. I want you to know that, Walter said, when we get it running, and we will get it running, it's not going to be because we fixed it. It's going to be because we gave it back what people took away from it. He looked at Marcus. There's a difference. Marcus nodded. I know. Walter walked to his truck. Marcus watched him go. He stood in the parking lot for a long time after the truck pulled away, in the cold, thinking about a man he'd never met lying in a hospital bed 2 miles away, asking about a bike that someone was giving everything to bring back to life. Then he went back inside, because tomorrow was going to be the hardest day yet, and he needed to be ready. The oil pump arrived at 8:51 in the morning. Joey had been watching for the delivery truck since 8 o'clock, and when it finally pulled up, he was out the door before Marcus could say anything, coming back in 2 minutes later with a small cardboard box held in both hands like something fragile. He set it on the center workbench and looked at Walter, who was already at the shovel head with his sleeves rolled and his cane against the wall. Walter didn't rush over. He finished what he was doing, seating the freshly machined rocker. Arm into the left intake position, checking the geometry by feel with his fingertips before committing to torque, and then he wiped his hands on a clean rag and walked to the workbench. He opened the box himself. He lifted the pump out and held it the same way he'd held the cracked one the day before, both hands turning it slowly, reading it. He examined the gear face. He checked the ceiling surfaces with a fingernail, feeling for pitting or warping that wouldn't show in a photograph. He held it up to the light and looked through the inlet port. The whole shop was watching him and pretending not to. Then Walter said, "It's good." Joey exhaled. Carlos nodded once. Even Derek in the back bay visibly relaxed. "Better than the original, actually," Walter continued, setting the pump down carefully. "Whoever owned this before knew what they had. It's been stored clean and dry. Gears are barely worn." He looked at Marcus. "We got lucky." "And we made our own luck," Marcus said. "Joey spent 4 hours on the phone yesterday." Walter glanced at Joey. Something in the old man's expression shifted, not a smile exactly, but the direction of one. "Good work," he said simply. For Joey, from Walter Boyd, that landed like a trophy. Walter picked up the pump and carried it to the shovelhead. And then the real work began. What Marcus noticed over the next 3 hours was that Walter never moved fast, but he never wasted a movement either. Every action connected directly to the next. He didn't reach for a tool and then second-guess himself. He didn't start a task and then stop to reconsider. He had thought everything through before his hands moved, and his hands then executed what his mind had already completed. It was a different kind of speed, not slow, efficient in a way that looked slow because there was no wasted motion, no backtracking, no repetition. Carlos had found the rhythm of assisting him by mid-morning, anticipating which tool came next, having the torque wrench ready before Walter asked for it, holding the work light at the correct angle without being told. The two of them had developed a working language that was mostly silence, punctuated by brief, specific requests, and it was working. At 10:15, Walter said, "Hand me the timing light." Carlos handed it over. Walter checked the timing. He looked at the reading. He set the timing light down and stood very still for a moment, and in that stillness, Marcus felt something shift in the atmosphere of the shop. "What is it?" Marcus asked. Walter didn't answer immediately. He picked up the timing light again and checked a second time. Then he straightened and said, "The advance mechanism is stuck." "Stuck how?" "The mechanical advance, the weights and springs inside the timing unit that advance the ignition as RPM increases, they're seized, frozen in the full retard position." He paused. "This engine, if we started it right now with everything else we've fixed, would start hard run rough, make almost no power, and overheat inside of 5 minutes, because the timing advance isn't functioning." Terrence had come over from his station without anyone noticing. "Can you free it?" "I can try," Walter said, "but the springs in there are 47 years old, and they've been sitting seized for probably 20 of those years. I free the mechanism and the springs may be too weak to function correctly, even if they're not broken. The spring rate has to be right, or the advance curve is wrong, and you're back to the same problem." He looked at the machine. "I need to pull the timing unit." "Do we have replacement springs?" Joey asked. "For a 1977 shovelhead advance unit." Walter looked at him. "We need to source them." Joey was already at the computer. "Give me the spec." Walter gave him the specification for memory wire diameter, coil count, free length spring rate without hesitating, the way you recite something you learned so long ago. It has become structural part of the architecture of who you are. Joey typed and searched and made calls, and Walter pulled the timing unit and laid it on the workbench and began the careful process of disassembly. At 11:30, Joey held up his phone. "I've got a guy in Phoenix. He makes reproduction advanced springs for AMF-era shovelheads. He has the correct specification in stock. But Marcus, he's in Phoenix. Overnight shipping. It's 11:30. He says if I order in the next 20 minutes, he can get them on a flight today. They'd be here tomorrow morning." Marcus looked at Walter. Walter was examining the advance weights under magnification and didn't look up. But he said, "Order them." "It adds another day to order them," Walter said again, still not looking up. "Because if the advance springs are wrong, the engine will run. It will run badly, and it will overheat, and it will cause damage, and then the sound that dying man hears through a phone will be an engine in distress." He set down his magnification glass. "Is that what we're doing this for?" The shop was quiet. "No," Marcus said. "Order them, Joey." Danny called at noon. Marcus took it in the back office, sitting at his desk with the door closed for the first time in 3 days. "He had a good morning," Danny said. And the relief in those 4 words was so concentrated it was almost painful to hear. He was lucid. He knew where he was. He talked to my mom for almost an hour. A pause. He talked about the bike. What did he say? He described it. The whole build, every part where he got it, what he paid for it, who helped him with which pieces. He remembered all of it. 47 years ago, and he remembered all of it like it was last week. Danny's voice was quiet with something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite joy. He said the tank took him 8 months to find. The right tank for a 77 build. He said there were only a few correct configurations, and he drove to 4 different states before he found the right one. He paid $60 for it in 1975 from a man in Albuquerque. Another pause. $60. He laughed when he said it. He said if he'd known what the bike would mean to him, he'd have paid $600. Marcus said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about the tank, the dented tank with the oxidized chrome. $60 in 1975 from a man in Albuquerque. Danny, he said, the work is taking longer than I hoped. We found more things that needed fixing. But the man working on it, he's not cutting corners. Every day I watch him, I understand better why that matters. How much longer? 1 more day? Maybe 2. Silence on the line. He had a good morning, Danny said again, quieter this time, as if reminding himself. Hold on to that, Marcus said. Moss said. Walter found the second disaster at 2:15 in the afternoon. He had been working through the valve train, checking stem clearances, inspecting the valve guides, assessing the condition of the valve springs, and the shop had settled into the working quiet of a Wednesday afternoon. Everyone at their stations, the radio playing low. It felt almost normal. It felt like a shop doing what a shop does. Then Walter stopped. He had both hands on the frame rail, not on the engine, on the frame, and he was not moving. Carlos noticed first. He didn't say anything, just went still on his stool watching. Then Walter said quietly, Marcus. Something in the way he said it, the flatness of it, the lack of anything that resembled reassurance, brought Marcus across the floor faster than a walk, but not quite a run. Walter was pointing at the left lower frame rail at a junction point where the rail met the engine mount. His finger was tracing a line in the metal. Marcus leaned in. He looked where Walter was pointing. At first, he didn't see it. The surface was dirty, darkened with old oil and grime, and the light in that section wasn't great even with the shop fluorescence. But then his eye found the line. Walter was tracing a crack that ran diagonally across the frame rail for approximately 2 inches, crossing the weld seam at the engine mount, starting thin at one end and widening to a visible gap at the other. Marcus felt the blood leave his face. How bad, he said. Bad, Walter said. He straightened up. His voice was completely level, which was somehow worse than if it had been alarmed. This crack has been developing for a long time. It crosses the engine mount weld, which means the mount itself is compromised. The engine is not securely attached to the frame. The shop had gone absolutely silent. Everyone had stopped. If this bike had been started in the condition it was when it came in, Walter said, and ridden even for a short distance, the vibration would have propagated this crack rapidly. Under load at speed, the frame could have failed catastrophically. Derek said from across the room, catastrophically, meaning the engine separates from the frame while the machine is in motion, Walter said, meaning the rider dies. Nobody spoke. Walter looked at Marcus. I need to know if there's a welder in the shop or if we need to bring one in. I can weld, Terrence said from his station. He stood up. Structural. I did bodywork for 3 years before I went into engines. What do you need? Walter turned to look at him with the same measuring quality he'd directed at everything else since he'd arrived. Have you ever welded a structural frame crack on a vintage motorcycle? No, Terrence said, but I've welded structural frame cracks on agricultural equipment that weighed 6 tons. Same principle, smaller scale. Walter held his gaze for a long moment. Then, come look at it. Terrence walked over and crouched beside the frame and looked at the crack for a long time without speaking. He ran his finger along it the same way Walter had. He looked at the weld seam. He checked the surrounding metal for flex. Then he stood up. I need to know the original material spec, Terrence said to Walter. If I use the wrong filler rod, the repair will be weaker than the base metal. Mild steel SAE 1018, consistent with AMF era production from that year, Walter said without hesitation. Terrence nodded. I've got ER70S6 rod. That'll work. But I need to clean this back to bare metal, no contamination from the oil residue or the repair fails. And I need at least 2 hours before the weld is cool enough to load. Then we've lost the afternoon, Walter said. It wasn't a complaint, just the fact. And the repair means the whole valve train work goes on hold because the engine can't be moved or vibrated while the weld cures, Terrence added. Walter nodded. Do it right. Terrence got his welding equipment. Duh. While Terrence worked, Walter sat at the center workbench with a cup of coffee that Marcus's newest hire, a 20-year-old named Sam, who mostly did oil changes and was largely invisible in the daily drama of the shop, had brought him without being asked. Walter drank it slowly and looked at the notes he'd made over 2 days, a small spiral notebook filled in pencil with a handwriting that was cramped and precise and covered every line. Marcus pulled up a stool beside him. Tell me something, Marcus said. Walter looked at him. In 45 years, has there been a machine you started working on and then couldn't finish? Walter was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. What happened? The part didn't exist anymore. Not anywhere. I searched for 14 months. I had people looking on 3 continents. The part was a specific casting from a manufacturer that had been bankrupt since 1961, and the tooling had been destroyed. He picked up his coffee. I had to tell the owner it was over, that some things can't come back. How did the owner take it? He cried, Walter said. He was 74 years old and he cried like a child. It was his father's machine. He paused. I still think about it. I'll think about it until I die. Marcus looked at the shovel head sitting partially disassembled with Terrence crouched beside the frame rail, the blue flicker of the welder's arc pulsing in the background. Is there anything on this bike that you can't source? Anything that would stop us completely? Walter considered the question with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. No, he said finally. Everything we need exists somewhere. The advanced springs are coming from Phoenix. The rocker arm we made ourselves, the pump we have. He paused. What I can't manufacture is time. The family's running out of it. I know that. He set his coffee down. And I am going as fast as I can go without building in failure. There's a speed below which the quality of the work degrades and the machine pays for it eventually. I will not go below that speed. Marcus nodded slowly. I believe you. Good, Walter said, because there's going to be a moment in the next day or two where the pressure to rush is going to feel overwhelming. The phone calls are going to get harder. The family is going to be desperate. Your crew is going to look at you and want you to make it go faster. He looked at Marcus directly. You're going to have to hold the line. Can you do that? The question landed quietly and sat there taking up space. Yes, Marcus said. Walter picked his notebook back up. Then we'll be all right. The advanced springs arrived the following morning at 7:48, 12 minutes ahead of the estimated delivery window, which Joey took as a personal victory and announced to the shop with a satisfaction that made even Derek smile. Walter opened the package at the workbench and checked each spring against his specification notes, measuring them with a micrometer, verifying the rate with a simple field test that Marcus had never seen before, compressing each spring against a calibrated surface and comparing the result to a reference. He rejected one of the 6 springs in the package because its rate was slightly off. Joey immediately called Phoenix and was told a replacement would ship that afternoon. We only need 2, Walter said. We have 5 good ones. We're fine. He installed the advanced springs in the timing unit with the focused quiet that characterized all of his work. The shop arranged around him in its now familiar orbit. Carlos nearby Joey at the parts computer. Derek working but watching Terrence cleaning the weld on the frame rail and beginning the careful process of inspecting the repair. At 9:30, Terrence called Walter over to look at the weld. Walter examined it for 3 minutes without speaking. He ran his thumb across the repair surface. He looked at the heat-affected zone on both sides. He tested the rigidity of the repaired rail by hand, applying force in the direction of the original crack. Then he said, "That's a good weld, Terrence." Terrence stood a little straighter. He didn't say anything, but Marcus saw it. "The engine mount?" Walter asked. "Solid," Terrence said. "I ran a bead across the junction on both sides while I had the metal clean. It's stronger now than it was when it left the factory." Walter nodded. "That's the goal." He turned back to the timing unit. At 11, Marcus's phone buzzed. Not Danny this time. A number he didn't recognize, but with a 415 area code. He answered it. The voice on the other end was old, rough and slow and careful, the voice of a man for whom speaking had become an effort that required marshaling resources. But it was absolutely present, fully aware, each word chosen. "Is this Marcus Webb?" the voice said. Marcus felt something move in his chest. "Yes, sir. My name is Salvatore Reyes." A pause for breath. "I understand you have my motorcycle." The shop seemed to get quieter, though objectively nothing had changed. Marcus turned toward the far wall, giving himself a private angle. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "We do. My nephew tells me there's an old man working on it." Another pause. "He says the old man knows what he's doing." "He's the best I've ever seen," Marcus said, and he meant it without qualification. A long exhale on the other end of the line. "I built that bike myself," Salvatore said, "piece by piece. 3 years I spent finding the right parts. People told me I was wasting my time, said it would never come together. Wright said I didn't know what I was doing." A brief sound that might have been a laugh, small and tired and real. "I proved them wrong." "Yes, sir, you did," Marcus said. "The man working on it, he says the original build was good. He says what happened to the bike afterward wasn't the bike's fault." Silence on the line. A long silence. And in it, Marcus could hear breathing that was labored but steady. Then Salvatore said, "That's exactly right." His voice had changed just slightly, something come loose in it. "That's exactly right." Marcus pressed the phone harder against his ear. "Mr. Reyes, we are going to finish this. I want you to know that." "I know," Salvatore said. "Simple. Absolute. I know you are." A pause. "Tell the old man, tell him that bike carried me through some of the best years of my life. Tell him it deserves better than what it got." "I'll tell him," Marcus said, "and tell him thank you." The voice was quieter now, getting tired. "Tell him there aren't enough people like him left." The line went quiet. Marcus stood with the phone pressed to his ear for a moment after it clicked off. Then he walked across the shop floor to where Walter Boyd was bent over the shovelhead's timing unit with a look of complete concentration. "Walter," Marcus said. Walter looked up. Marcus told him, word for word, what Salvatore Reyes had said. Walter listened without moving. When Marcus finished, Walter was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at the engine. He put his hand on it, the same gesture he had made on the very first morning, palm flat, reading the machine. Then he said quietly, "Let's get back to work." And he did. The afternoon Salvatore called Walter worked 4 hours straight without stopping. Not fast, never fast, but with a density of focus that Marcus had never seen in another human being, a quality of presence that made every other sound in the shop feel distant, like noise from another building. Walter moved through the valve train with the advanced unit now correctly installed, and time checking each stem clearance, twice adjusting where the wear had moved, tolerances outside the acceptable range, replacing the 2 valve stem seals that had hardened past function. His hands knew the work the way a musician's hands know a piece. They have played 10,000 times, not thinking about the notes, just playing. Carlos had stopped pretending to do anything else. He sat on his stool and assisted and watched, and occasionally he asked a quiet question, and Walter answered it without looking up, the answers precise and complete, and offered without impatience. At 4 in the afternoon, Walter straightened and said, "Carburetor." He had been building toward it for 2 days. Everything else, the pump, the rockers, the timing, the frame, the valve train, had been the foundation. The carburetor was where the engine would either breathe correctly or not breathe at all, and both of them knew it. He lifted it from the cloth where it had been sitting since Terrence's original disassembly and carried it to the clean bench Joey had prepped. He set it down and looked at it for a moment. Then he began. "The float height is the first thing," he said, not to anyone in particular, but Carlos leaned in anyway. "Whoever rebuilt this last set it 4 millimeters high. That's what's been driving the rich condition. Over time, that means unburned fuel washing the cylinder walls, carbon buildup throughout the combustion chamber, fouled plugs, degraded oil from fuel dilution." He was already removing the float bowl as he spoke. "The carburetor itself is actually in decent condition. The casting is sound, the throttle shaft bushings are worn but functional. What we have here is a competent piece of equipment that was set up incorrectly and then left that way for 20 years. Can you set it right?" Carlos asked. Walter glanced at him. "I already am." He worked through the carburetor with the same methodical depth, cleaning each passage with solvent and compressed air, checking the needle jet for wear, verifying the main jet size against the correct specification for the engine's displacement and the expected operating altitude. He set the float height by feel and measurement simultaneously, a process that took 20 minutes. Because he measured it, adjusted. It measured it again and adjusted it again until the reading was exactly where he wanted it and his hands agreed with the number. At 5:45, he set the carburetor down and said, "We're close." Marcus looked up from the invoice he'd been pretending to read. "How close?" "Tomorrow morning, I reassemble the top-end torque, everything to spec, reinstall the carburetor, set the final timing gap. The plugs check the primary chain tension, and then we find out." Walter picked up his coffee cold for the last 2 hours untouched. He drank it anyway. "One thing left that I haven't resolved." "What's that?" "The petcock," Walter said. "The fuel shutoff valve. It's original to the bike, and the rubber diaphragm inside it has almost certainly deteriorated. If I open the fuel line with a failed petcock, we flood the engine before we ever try to start it." Joey was already at the computer. "Petcock for a 77 shovelhead. Pingle makes a direct replacement," Walter said. "Standard thread, correct fitting for the tank. Most shops that carry vintage Harley parts will have one." Joey made 3 calls in 4 minutes. The third one had it. "Biker's Edge on Route 12. They close at 7. I can go now." "Go," Marcus said. Joey grabbed his keys and was out the door in under 30 seconds. Marcus watched him go and felt something that it took him a moment to identify. It was the feeling of a team that had stopped being a collection of individuals with separate skill sets and had become something else, something that moved together, that anticipated, that cared about the outcome as a shared thing rather than someone else's problem. He thought about Danny Reyes pushing that bike through the door 6 days ago with red-rimmed eyes and shaking hands. 6 days. It felt like a month. Joey came back with the petcock at 6:42. Walter inspected it, confirmed the thread specs, set it on the clean bench with the other components waiting for final assembly. Then he picked up his cane and his canvas bag and told Marcus he'd be back at 7 in the morning. "Walter," Marcus said. The old man stopped. "Are you all right?" It was a genuine question, not courtesy. Walter considered it. "My hands hurt," he said. "They've hurt for about 6 years. It's not going to stop me from finishing this." He looked at Marcus. "Are you asking if I'm going to make it to the end of this job?" "Yes." "I'm going to make it to the end of this job," Walter said. "I've been waiting for a job worth finishing for 3 years. This is it." He turned and walked to the door. 7 o'clock. The door closed behind him, Derek from the back bay. "That man is something else." Nobody disagreed. Marcus called Danny at 8 that night. "Tomorrow," Marcus said. "We're doing final assembly tomorrow. If everything goes the way Walter expects it to go, we could be looking at a first start attempt tomorrow afternoon." The silence on Danny's end was the silence of someone who doesn't trust good news yet. "Tomorrow afternoon." "Possibly. Don't set a clock by it. But yes, possibly tomorrow afternoon." "Marcus." Danny's voice had dropped to something that was barely above a whisper. "He had a hard day today, really hard. They had to adjust his medication twice. He wasn't always present. He kept drifting." A pause. "But at 9 o'clock tonight, he came back. He was completely clear. He looked at my aunt and he said, 'It's going to run. I can feel it.' Just like that, out of nowhere." Marcus sat with that for a moment. "I believe him," Marcus said. "So do I," Danny said. "That's what scares me." Walter arrived at 6:58 the next morning. He didn't say good morning. He set his bag down, rolled his sleeves, picked up his notebook, reviewed his notes from the previous day, and walked to the shovelhead. The shop assembled itself around him within 10 minutes. Carlos on his stool, Joey at the parts bench with the final assembly components laid out in sequence, Terrence and Derek at their stations, but oriented toward the center of the room. The reassembly of the top end took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Walter torqued the rocker boxes, the original one, and the repaired one into specification, checking the torque on each fastener twice. He installed the new valve stem seals. He set the valve lash with a feeler gauge working through each cylinder, methodically adjusting and rechecking until every measurement was exactly where it needed to be. He installed the freshly rebuilt carburetor and connected the fuel line to the new petcock. He gapped the spark plugs, new plugs, the correct heat range for the application, and threaded them in by hand before using a torque wrench. At 10:20, he stood back and looked at the assembled engine. The shop was very quiet. Primary chain tension, he said. Carlos handed him the correct tool. Walter checked the tension, found it at the outer edge of acceptable, and adjusted the tensioner by a quarter turn. He checked it again, nodded. Oil, he said. Joey brought the correct weight. Walter had specified it 2 days ago. A straight weight oil, rather than a modern multi-viscosity, because the clearances in this engine had been built around the behavior of straight weight oil, and putting modern oil through it would change the lubrication dynamics in ways that could cause problems on a first start after 20 years of sitting. Walter filled the oil tank slowly, watching the level. Fuel, he said. Carlos brought the small can of fresh gasoline they'd prepared that morning. Walter opened the petcock and watched the fuel flow through the line into the carburetor bowl. He watched it for 30 seconds to confirm the petcock was sealing correctly when closed. It was. He closed the petcock, he stepped back, he looked at the bike. The whole shop looked at the bike. It looked different than it had 6 days ago. Not restored, Walter had made no effort toward cosmetics, and the chrome was still dull, and the tank was still dented, and the seat leather was still cracked and peeling. But it looked like a machine that had been put right, tight, considered. Every component in its correct relationship to every other component, every fastener at its correct torque, every system rebuilt from the inside with the kind of care that doesn't show on the surface, but that the machine carries in its function. It looked like something that could run. Before we attempt to start it, Walter said, and his voice brought everyone's attention to him immediately. I want to tell you what to expect. This engine has not run in 20 years. The rings have been sitting in one position. The cylinder walls are going to be dry on the first few kicks. We're going to see smoke, some of it from oil burning off surfaces. It's been sitting on some of it from the assembly lube on the new components. We will hear noise. The engine will be rough when it first fires. The valve train will be loud until the oil circulates and the hydraulic components pressurize. He looked around at the crew. None of that is failure. All of that is normal for a first start after this length of downtime. What does failure look like? Derek asked. It doesn't start after 20 kicks, Walter said. Or it starts and immediately makes a sound that indicates mechanical distress, a knock, a scrape, anything that doesn't smooth out within 30 seconds of running. He paused. If that happens, we stop immediately and we find out why before we try again. We do not push through bad sounds on an engine like this. Everyone nodded. Who's kicking it? Joey asked. Marcus and Walter looked at each other. Marcus kicks, Walter said. It's his shop. Man. Marcus had not kicked at a shovelhead in 11 years. He had owned one briefly in his early 30s, a 74, a much better preserved machine than this one, and he remembered the specific ritual of it, the way the engine had to be approached, the precise sequence of prime and tickle and position and kick that the old machines demanded before they would cooperate. Modern bikes started with a button. Shovelheads started with intention. He stood beside the bike and looked at it for a moment. Walter said quietly behind him, Petcock open. Tickle the carb until fuel just shows at the tickler. 3 slow kicks. Through with the choke closed to prime, then full choke, full throttle, and kick like you mean it. Marcus did exactly that. He opened the petcock. He pressed the tickler on the side of the carburetor until a drop of fuel appeared at the base. He kicked through slowly 3 times, feeling the compression, and released the old engine, accepting the priming strokes with a solidity that told him even now, even before it fired, that something real had been accomplished here. The compression felt right, even and strong and there. He set the choke. He opened the throttle to roughly a quarter position. He kicked. The engine didn't fire, but it spoke a deep percussive cough that rolled through the frame and into the floor of the shop. Everyone in the room felt it in their feet. Joey made a sound involuntarily, a small sound. He put his hand over his mouth. Marcus kicked again. Another cough, stronger. The engine was finding the edges of itself, remembering the sequence, remembering what it was supposed to do. Third kick. Nothing. Silence. Marcus straightened and looked at Walter. It's cold, Walter said. The fuel is just reaching the chamber. Kick again. Fourth kick. The engine coughed and caught for half a second, A bright, jagged burst of sound that filled the shop for one heartbeat, and then died, and in that half second, every man in the room stopped breathing. Then silence. Marcus stood over the bike with his hands on the bars and his chest heaving slightly from the effort. He looked at Walter. Walter's expression had not changed. He was reading something, not the engine with his eyes, but with his ears processing what that half-second burst had told him about the state of the machine. Again, Walter said, don't hesitate on the downstroke. Fifth kick, nothing. Sixth, nothing. Marcus's jaw tightened. He adjusted his footing. He was breathing harder now, the physical effort of kicking a cold shovel head accumulating in his thigh and hip. He shook it out, resettled. Seventh kick, and the engine fired and ran for 3 full seconds before dying. And in those 3 seconds, the sound was enormous and olive and wrong and right, and at the same time rough and ragged and uncertain. But they're unmistakably, undeniably, they're the sound of an engine that had not run in 20 years, discovering that it still could. Carlos said yes under his breath. Walter said nothing. He walked to the right side of the bike and put his hand near the exhaust port, not touching it, sensing the heat, and listened to the silence after the engine stopped with the focused attention of a doctor with a stethoscope. What did you hear? Marcus asked. I heard it running, Walter said, and something moved in his voice on those 4 words, something he didn't otherwise allow, something that had been compressed and held back for days and had just found the smallest outlet. He cleared his throat. I need to adjust the idle circuit. The mixture screw is slightly lean at low throttle, which is why it's not holding an idle. That's a 2-minute adjustment. He reached for a flat screwdriver. He turned the mixture screw out 1/4 turn. Try again, he said. Marcus kicked. The engine fired on the second kick and ran, rough, loud, smoking from 2 places along the exhaust and from somewhere around the rocker boxes where assembly lube was burning off. The valve train was hammering a metallic chatter that filled the shop with industrial noise. The idle was uneven surging and dropping, the carburetor still finding its equilibrium after 20 years of silence. But it was running. It was running. Marcus stood back from the bike with both hands raised slightly from his sides, a gesture that wasn't quite surrender and wasn't quite celebration, more like the posture of a man who has been holding something up for a very long time and has just been allowed to set it down. He was breathing hard and his eyes were bright, and he was not going to cry in front of his crew, and he was fairly close to doing it anyway. Joey was already on his phone. Boss, Danny, it's running. It's actually... His voice broke. He turned away and pressed the phone harder against his ear. It's running, man. You need to call the hospital. You need to call them right now. Derek was at his station, but he was facing the wrong direction entirely, just looking at the bike with his arms folded and something on his face that he wasn't bothering to hide. Terrence said very quietly to no one, Lord have mercy. Walter stood to the right of the running engine with his hand near the exhaust. His eyes closed, his head tilted slightly, listening. Then his eyes opened, and the expression on his face changed. It didn't become alarmed. Walter Boyd was not a man whose face did alarm in the conventional sense, but something shifted in it, a sharpening, a focusing that was different from the focused attention he'd maintained for 6 days. He reached forward and closed the choke. The engine died. The silence hit the room like a physical thing. Everyone looked at Walter. Marcus said, What? Walter didn't answer immediately. He walked slowly around to the left side of the bike. He crouched painfully, his cane forgotten against the workbench. He put his hand on the left lower frame rail, the section Terrence had welded 2 days ago, and more specifically on the section just forward of it. He pressed his palm flat against the metal. He stayed that way for 10 seconds. Then he stood up and turned to Marcus, and his voice when he spoke was completely level in a way that told Marcus everything before the words did. There's another crack, Walter said. The room did not make a sound. Forward of Terrence's repair. Different fault line. I didn't see it because the surface contamination was hiding it and I was focused on the known damage. But the vibration of the engine running just told me it's there. He looked at Marcus. The bike ran, but if we had let it run for 5 more minutes, 10 minutes under load at the frequencies this engine produces. He stopped. The frame would have failed, Marcus said. The frame would have failed, Walter confirmed, and if someone was on it, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Marcus put both hands flat on the center workbench and looked at the floor. The shop was so quiet that the traffic outside normal Wednesday afternoon traffic on an ordinary street in an ordinary city sounded very far away, like sound from a different world. Then Walter said, "Terrence." Terrence was already standing. "I see it now. I should have checked the full rail length after the first repair. I should have." "You found the first crack because I pointed you at it," Walter said, and his voice was not unkind. "This one I missed too. That's not on you." He looked at the frame. "How long to repair it correctly?" Terrence crouched and examined the new crack with a flashlight for a full minute. "The access is better here than on the first one. The surrounding metal is clean. I prepped the whole rail when I did the first weld." He stood. 3 hours, including cure time before we can load the engine again. Walter nodded. "Then we have 3 hours." Marcus straightened up from the workbench. He picked up his phone. He called Danny. Danny answered on the first ring. "I heard it," he said, immediately breathless. "Joey called me. I heard it was running. Is it?" "Danny," Marcus said, "we have one more thing to fix, a safety issue in the frame. We need 3 more hours." Silence. 3 hours, Danny repeated. 3 hours, Marcus said. "And then it's done. For real. No more surprises." A long pause on the line. "Marcus," Danny's voice was stripped down to the bone. "They called me 20 minutes ago. The hospital. They said tonight might be the night. They said if there's anyone to call them now." Marcus closed his eyes. 3 hours, he said again. And he meant it like a promise, like something he would keep regardless of what it cost him. 3 hours, Danny. Hold on. He hung up. He looked at Walter. Walter was already pulling on his work gloves, preparing to assist Terrence, moving with the particular unhurried speed of a man who understands that urgency and rushing are not the same thing, that the only way through is forward, and forward requires doing it right. 3 hours, Marcus said to the room, and every man in the shop went to work. Terrence welded the second crack in 2 hours and 41 minutes. Not 3 hours. 2 hours and 41 minutes, because he did not waste a single movement from the moment he picked up the torch to the moment he set it down, and because every man in the shop understood, without being told, that 19 minutes was not nothing. 19 minutes was real. 19 minutes might be everything. Marcus stood near the frame and watched Terrence work and did not speak, did not pace, did not check his phone every 30 seconds the way he wanted to. He stood still and let the man work and trusted what he saw, which was a welder who had found something in himself over the past 6 days that he hadn't known was there. A depth of care for an outcome that had nothing to do with his paycheck and everything to do with the simple human fact of a man in a hospital bed who had asked for one thing. Walter stood on the other side of the frame. He also did not speak. He watched the weld with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, reading the bead as it formed, checking the heat-affected zone with his eyes, monitoring the color of the metal around the repair for any sign of stress or warping. When Terrence finally set the torch down and straightened up, he looked at Walter first. Not Marcus, Walter. Walter crouched and examined the weld. He ran his thumb along it. He pressed his palm against the frame rail on both sides of the repair and held it there. Then he said, "That's better than the first one." Terrence let out a breath that had been held for 2 hours and 41 minutes. "Cure time," Walter said. "We wait 40 minutes before we load the engine. Not 30, 40. 40 minutes, Marcus confirmed. He picked up his phone and called Danny. Danny answered before the first ring finished. "Tell me." "The weld is done. We're waiting 40 minutes for it to cure, then we start it again." A sound on the other end that was not quite a word, just a sound, raw and unguarded. "Danny, how is he?" "He's still here." The voice was thin, stretched. "He's been in and out for the last 2 hours. The nurse says his vitals are dropping, but he keeps coming back, Marcus. Every time they think he's going under, he comes back." A pause. "My aunt says he's waiting. She says he's been waiting all week, and he's still waiting." Marcus looked at the shovel head, at the weld cooling on the frame rail, at Walter standing beside the machine with his hand still resting on the engine case. 40 minutes, Marcus said. "Then you call the hospital and you put the phone to his ear." "Okay," Danny said, then quieter. "Okay." Marcus hung up. He set the phone face down on the workbench so he couldn't watch the minutes crawl. Then he went and stood next to Walter. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Walter said without looking at Marcus, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" 1974. I was 26 years old. I was working in a shop in Bakersfield that smelled like cigarettes and transmission fluid, and the owner's lunch, which was always a tuna sandwich, without fail every single day. He paused. A man came in with a basket case Ironhead Sportster, completely destroyed, or so we thought. Every mechanic in that shop looked at it and said the same thing: scrap it, walk away, parts are worth more than the whole. A brief pause. I was the youngest person in that shop by 8 years. I said I wanted to try. What happened? The owner told me if I wanted to waste my time, I could waste it on my own hours, not his. So I worked on it every night for 6 weeks after my shift. I had no idea what I was doing. Not really. I made mistakes. I sourced the wrong parts twice. I had to redo 2 weeks of work because I'd assembled a component backward. He was quiet for a moment. The night it first ran, I was alone in the shop. No one saw it. No one was there. It was 2 a.m. and I kicked it and it fired and ran, and I stood there in an empty shop at 2 a.m. and I cried like a child. Marcus looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Walter turned his head and looked back. Because that was the moment I understood what this work actually is. It's not mechanical. The mechanical part is just the language. He looked back at the shovel head. The work is belief. You believe the machine can come back when everyone else has stopped believing. You hold that belief through every setback and every failure, and every time the sensible thing would be to walk away. And then if you've done your job right and you've held that belief long enough, he stopped. The engine runs, Marcus said. The engine runs, Walter said. The shop was quiet around them. The weld was cooling. The clock was moving. Marcus said, Walter, why did you retire? A long pause. My wife got sick, Walter said. Took 3 years. I was with her for all 3 of them. When she was gone, I didn't know what to do with my hands anymore. I'd been doing this work for 45 years, and suddenly I picked up a wrench, and it felt like a foreign object. He flexed his right hand, slowly looking at it. I thought maybe the work was gone. That grief had taken it. But it wasn't gone. No, Walter said. It was waiting. He looked at the shovel head one more time. Same as that engine. At the 38-minute mark, Walter stood up from his stool, walked to the frame, and pressed both palms against the repaired rail. He held them there. He moved them 6 inches forward of the weld, 6 inches back. He knelt and looked at the underside of the repair. He stood up. It's ready, he said. 2 minutes ahead of schedule. No one pointed that out. Marcus just looked at his crew and said, let's go. Joey had the fuel can ready. Carlos had a clean rag in his hand for reasons he couldn't entirely have explained. Derek had moved from the back bay to the edge of the center floor without consciously deciding to. Terrence stood near his weld with his arms at his sides, not folded open, like a man who didn't want to close himself off from whatever was about to happen. Walter checked the petcock, checked the fuel level in the bowl, checked the ignition timing one final time with the timing light, and the reading was exactly what he'd set it to 2 days ago, unchanged, holding true. He stepped back. He looked at Marcus. The mixture screw is set where I left it, he said. The idle should hold this time. Let it warm up for 2 full minutes before you try to give it any throttle. The rings need to seat against the cylinder walls, and the oil needs to circulate to the top end. Marcus nodded. And Marcus, Walter's voice dropped slightly. When it runs, let it run. Don't hover over it. Don't keep checking it. Trust the work. Marcus nodded again. He took his position beside the bike. The shop was absolutely silent. He opened the petcock. He tickled the carburetor. He felt the fuel reach the bowl, a small change in resistance at the tickler that told him the circuit was primed. He set the choke. He set the throttle. He kicked. The engine fired on the first kick. Not a cough this time. Not a burst and a die. It fired and it caught, and it held rough and loud and smoking from the exhaust and hammering from the valve train, all the things Walter had said to expect, all the normal sounds of an engine waking up from a 20-year sleep. But it held. The idle surged and found a level and surged again and came back, and with each cycle it smoothed fractionally the carburetor, learning its own calibration, the oil climbing through the passages to the top end, the rings beginning the first moments of their new seating against the cylinder walls. It ran. Marcus stepped back, both hands at his sides, and it ran. Joey turned away from the bike and pressed both fists against his mouth, and his shoulders shook once, just once, and then he got himself back. Carlos had the rag pressed flat against the workbench with both hands, like he needed something to hold on to. Derek said nothing, but his jaw was working, and he was staring at the engine with the expression of a man watching something he will remember for the rest of his life. Terrence put his face in his hands, not crying, just receiving it, letting it in. Walter stood to the right of the running engine. His eyes were closed. His head was slightly bowed. His cane was in his right hand, and his left hand was hanging at his side, completely still. He was listening, not inspecting, not analyzing, not reading the machine for problems or deviations or anything that needed correction. Just listening. Marcus watched him and understood in a way that would have taken him weeks to articulate if anyone had asked him later that for Walter Boyd this moment was not about the motorcycle. The motorcycle was the medium. What Walter was actually listening to was something older and harder and more essential. The sound of a thing being proven true that he had staked his belief on when the evidence was against him. The sound of not giving up. Then Marcus picked up his phone. Danny answered on half a ring. "It's running," Marcus said. 3 words, that was all. For 2 seconds, there was nothing on the line. Then Marcus heard Danny's voice. Not words just sound, the sound a person makes when something they have been bracing against for a very long time finally doesn't happen, when the thing they feared most yields at the last possible moment. It lasted only a second. Then Danny got himself back. "I'm calling the hospital right now," Danny said. "Don't turn it off. Don't touch anything. I'm calling right now." The line went to hold music, a tinny, generic hospital hold tone that was profoundly absurd against the backdrop of a 1977 shovelhead running at idle in the middle of a repair shop floor. Marcus stood with the phone to his ear and waited, and the engine ran, and the shop remained absolutely still around it, every man holding his position as if any movement might break the spell. 40 seconds on hold. 50. Then Danny's voice came back, and it was different, compressed, urgent, the voice of someone moving through a hospital corridor. "They're putting the phone to his ear, right now. Marcus, put yours near the engine, as close as you can get." Marcus walked to the shovelhead. He crouched beside the engine. He held the phone 6 inches from the exhaust pipe where the sound was loudest, that deep, uneven mechanical thunder of an engine that had been silent for 20 years announcing itself back into the world. He held it there. On the other end of the line, through the phone, he heard something. He heard a voice. Old and rough, and barely there, threaded through with effort, the voice of a man for whom breathing had become a task that required deliberate thought. But it was there, present, real. He heard Salvatore Reyes say in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but that carried everything in it, "There she is." Just that. 3 words, the same number as Marcus had said to Danny. There she is. And then Marcus heard something else, a sound that started small and built not from Salvatore, but from the room around him, from Danny, and from whoever else was in that hospital room at that moment, the gathered voices of people who had been waiting for something and had just received it. A sound that was grief and relief and joy and loss all running together into the single overwhelming fact that love, when it is real, does not give up. Marcus stayed crouched beside the engine with his phone outstretched and let the sound of both rooms occupy the same moment, the engine running in his shop, the family crying in that hospital room 2 miles away, and he understood that he was holding the phone in the exact middle of something that would never happen again, and that he had been privileged in the fullest sense of the word to be part of. He didn't try to say anything. There was nothing to say. He let the engine do the talking. Fire. It ran for 11 minutes. Walter let it warm fully, then nodded to Marcus, who slowly advanced the throttle through its range, gently, incrementally, giving the engine room to respond. The idle smoothed as the oil reached every passage and the temperature came up and the carburetor found its operating equilibrium. The valve train quieted from a hammer to a rapid rhythmic tap that was loud by modern standards and completely correct by the standards of the machine's own era. At 11 minutes, Walter put his hand on Marcus's shoulder and Marcus eased the throttle back to idle, and they let it sit there for another 30 seconds, ticking over steady and strong and alive. Then Marcus reached down and switched the ignition off. The engine stopped. The silence afterward was the loudest thing Marcus had ever heard. Walter straightened. He picked up a clean rag from the workbench and wiped his hands slowly, each finger individually, the way he did everything with completeness, with care, as if the action deserved his full attention even now. He folded the rag, he set it down. He turned to Marcus. "It's done," he said. 2 words. Quiet and absolute and complete. Marcus looked at the bike. At the machine that had come in 6 days ago, as a rusted, seized, cracked, failed, multiplied, betrayed collection of old metal, and had left not restored, not beautiful, but right as the thing Salvatore Reyes had built it to be. A machine that ran. "Walter," Marcus said, "I don't know how to." "You don't have to," Walter said. I want to. Walter looked at him. His eyes were gray and steady and very tired in a way that had nothing to do with defeat. It was the tiredness of completion. The deep fatigue that comes from having given everything to something and reached the end of it with the work intact. "Buy me a cup of coffee," Walter said. "That's how." Marcus laughed. The sound surprised him. It came out sudden and genuine and slightly too loud for the room. Joey laughed too, the tension breaking from him in a single sharp exhale. Carlos put his face in his hands again, but this time his shoulders were shaking with something different. Even Derek smiled, a full, unguarded, unself-conscious smile that Marcus had never seen on that face before. Terrence walked to the shovel head and put his hand on the tank. Just his hand, resting there, not speaking. Marcus understood the gesture completely. Danny arrived 40 minutes later. He came through the door the same way he'd come through it 6 days ago. Quickly, urgently, his jacket, the same one that was a size too big. But everything else about him was different. His eyes were still red, but not with the held-back grief of that first morning. They were red with something that had already been released and survived. He stopped in front of the shovel head. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned to Marcus. Is it okay if I... He gestured toward the bike, not finishing the sentence. "It's your bike," Marcus said. Danny put both hands on the tank. He gripped it not gently the way you hold something you were afraid you were going to lose. His knuckles went white briefly and then relaxed. He pressed his forehead against the tank for a moment, eyes closed. Nobody in the shop moved. When he straightened up, he looked across the room and found Walter. Walter was standing by the workbench with his cane and his canvas bag ready to leave, as if he might slip out without ceremony, as if the work being done was sufficient and the rest was unnecessary. Danny walked across the shop floor and stopped in front of him. He was several inches taller than Walter, 40 years younger. He stood in front of this old man with the stained hands and the quiet eyes and the cane, and he said, "My uncle wants me to tell you something." Walter waited. He said, and I'm quoting him exactly because I wrote it down, because I knew I'd want to get it right. Danny pulled out his phone and looked at the screen. "Tell the man who fixed my bike that he gave me back something I thought was gone forever. Not the bike. Something bigger than the bike. Tell him I know what it costs to care about something that much. Tell him I see him. And tell him that wherever I'm going next, I'm going there knowing that men like him still exist." The shop was completely silent. Walter stood with his cane and his bag, and he received those words with his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Danny's shoulder. Not avoidance, but the posture of a man who is working very hard to stay composed and succeeding by the thinnest margin. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell him the bike was always worth saving. It just needed someone to remember that." Danny nodded. He extended his hand. Walter took it. They shook not the brief transactional handshake of strangers concluding business, but the kind of handshake that lasts long enough to become something else, where both hands grip and hold and say the things that words aren't precise enough to carry. Then Walter picked up his bag. He nodded once to Marcus. He nodded once to the crew, to Joey, to Terrence, to Derek, to Carlos, and each man received the nod and understood its weight. He walked to the door. He pushed it open. He left. Marcus stood in the middle of his shop and watched the door close behind Walter Boyd, and he thought about what the old man had said in the parking lot on that first night, that the work wasn't mechanical, that the mechanical part was just the language, that the work was belief. He looked at the shovel head. He looked at his crew, 4 men who had come into this week as mechanics and were leaving it as something slightly different, something they would carry with them from here into every other room, and every other problem and every other machine that everyone else had given up on. He looked at Danny Reyes, who was standing beside his uncle's motorcycle with one hand still on the tank, talking quietly on his phone to the hospital, to his family, to whoever was in that room with Salvatore, his voice too low to hear, but his face completely open in a way that faces only get when the worst thing didn't happen and the impossible thing did. Marcus Webb had been running a shop for 22 years. He had seen a lot of machines come through the door. He had never seen one fight this hard to be heard. He thought about what Salvatore had said when he called, about the people who had told him the bike would never come together right, about proving them wrong, about $60 for a tank in Albuquerque in 1975 from a man whose name he probably couldn't remember, and how he'd have paid $600 if he'd known. He thought about what Walter had said about the night in Bakersfield in 1974, alone in an empty shop at 2 in the morning, crying over an engine that ran. He thought about the sound of Salvatore Reyes' voice through a phone held 6 inches from an exhaust pipe. There she is. Machines don't die because they're old. They die because people stop believing in them. And sometimes it takes the oldest hands in the room, hands that hurt, hands that have spent 45 years learning the language of machines that everyone else gave up on, to reach into the silence where something used to live and call it back. Walter Boyd drove home that afternoon and parked his truck in his driveway and sat in it for a while without going inside. He wasn't thinking about the bike. He was thinking about his wife, about her voice, about the 3 years at the end and the years before that, and the fact that she had been the first person he had ever called after a long repair to tell her the machine ran, to hear her say, "I knew you'd get it," those 5 words every time without fail, because she believed in his work the way he believed in machines. He sat in the truck for a while, then he picked up his phone and called Marcus. Marcus answered on the second ring. "Walter, I'll need a couple of days," Walter said. "But after that, if you have something else that needs the right kind of attention, call me." A pause on Marcus's end, short, just long enough to mean something. "I'll call you," Marcus said. "Good," Walter said. He hung up. He went inside. And for the first time in 3 years, the work was waiting for him again. Not behind him, not lost, not taken by grief, but ahead of him, the way it had always been, the way it was always meant to be. Some things, when they are built right and cared for with enough patience and enough belief, do not stay broken forever. That is not a small thing. That is everything.